So it's interesting here how little I can actually see of the slides. They've also taped this so that we can't mess up the AV too much. All I can do is click a button. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes about why I got into this field in the first place, which is through pretty deep personal and family experience of mental illness, and then talk very briefly about some of the research that our team is doing. So I'll start talking about my father, Virgil Hinshaw Jr., born in 1919 outside of Chicago, the fourth of four boys. His father was the chairman of the Prohibition National Party. During the passage of the 18th Amendment, at family reunions, we often have a toast to the great work of our prohibitionist grandfather. And my grandmother was a missionary in Central and South America. When my dad was 3, his mother died. This is a photograph from an international prohibition newsletter from 1923 in the spring, entitled The Motherless Hinshaw Boys. So there's my Uncle Harold standing up to the right of the wagon, my Uncle Randall over to the left, my Uncle Robert, who became a psychiatrist and psychologist because he witnessed the boy next to him, my father, Virgil Jr., and his first suicide attempt at age 16, and told me many years later that he knew that day he would go into psychiatry and psychology. So my grandfather moved the 4 boys out from Chicago to the West Coast. They settled in Pasadena. My grandfather remarried, another missionary, had 2 more boys. We'll see all the boys in a few minutes. And it was a very religious Quaker household, a lot of sports, a lot of athletics. But my step-grandmother singled out my dad, little Junior, a couple years later, as the one she would discipline. And as my dad wrote years later in his journals, he was subject, when the other boys were out of the home, to pretty ritualistic physical and later sexual abuse. If you have the genes for bipolar disorder and you've experienced early trauma, it's a huge predictor of a worse course of this condition and more difficulty responding to treatment. Life went on, and in the fall of 1936, when my dad was about to start his senior year at Pasadena Community College, they had 4 years then, 11th, 12th, and first years of college, he began to get preoccupied with what the international prohibition leaders who came to the family home in Pasadena talked about, was that the fascists had taken over in Germany and Italy and were going to take over the world. And Dad was a student of history and an athlete as well, and thought, I need to do something to stop the fascist threat. And it wasn't until the fall of 36 that he got the energy, through not essentially sleeping for 3 consecutive days, wandering the streets of Pasadena, and on the middle of the 3rd night, he had the idea that he could save the world, because if he could only stay awake till dawn and spread his arms, they would turn into wings and he would fly. And the world leaders would witness this call to action. So it doesn't take much of a diagnostician to realize now he was quickly escalating into a manic episode. He became from hypomanic to fully manic pretty quickly. He climbed the house at dawn when all the family was asleep and took his first flight, which lasted about 1.25 seconds, to the pavement below, knocked himself out, broke his wrist. The older brothers rushed out, got him to the hospital. He was finally sent to Norwalk County Hospital, now Norwalk State, one of the few state hospitals left, with the diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia. The United States essentially didn't recognize manic depression or bipolar illness for a period of about 50 or 60 years. What was his treatment at Norwalk at age 16, turning 17? He was tied to his bed at night so he wouldn't wander, and there were no medications and no psychotherapy. 6 months later, he began to get better. The staff decided to release him one weekend. He returned to Pasadena, and what did the family do for an outpatient care plan? I'm being sarcastic. There was none. What did the family discuss? Nothing, because it was too shameful. Maybe it would jinx it. Maybe he'd relapse. So Dad finished 12th grade and then went on to the rest of junior college, earning all A's, made a very bad decision then. He was accepted into UC Berkeley on a full scholarship, but he decided to go to Stanford instead, which never really quite understood why. Didn't go to Europe or the Pacific for World War II because he was both a conscientious objector, but he was 4F because he'd been 6 months in a county hospital. At Princeton, studying philosophy, oh yes, by the way, he was interested in the big ideas of the world in philosophy. And his first mentor was Bertrand Russell, who was over on a sabbatical from England. And then during his last year, while he was writing his dissertation, he was introduced to a physicist next door at the Institute for Advanced Study named Albert Einstein, and wrote several chapters on Einstein's life. This was good mentorship in grad school. Nonetheless, when he finished his dissertation, finishing something's a good thing, but it's a stressful thing, and his girlfriend was maybe leaving him, and he took the train to New York City and banged on the apartment door, and the police were called, and he was believing he could predict the end of the war through telepathy, and was shipped to Philadelphia State Hospital, Byberry, known as the worst mental hospital in the United States. Several thousand men on the men's dorm, conditions very similar to the camps in Europe. Dad, in fact, thought he was in Europe at a concentration camp. He was that psychotic at the time. 6 months later, again, almost magically, he got better. He had received some insulin coma therapy there, took the train back to California, applied for jobs, and became an assistant professor of philosophy at Ohio State. He met my mother, who was a grad student in history. They fell in love and got married. And what did Dad tell Mom during the latter phases of their courtship? I had a little trouble in high school and at Princeton. That was the sum total of his disclosure. Who would marry someone who was crazy and who'd been in a mental hospital? When did Mom know? When she became pregnant with me and my sister in the 50s. Both pregnancies triggered major manias and subsequent depressions. What did the psychiatrist tell Dad, who was worried about me and my little sister? What should he say? And the words were clear. Never tell your children about mental illness. It will permanently destroy them. You and your wife are forbidden from ever discussing it. That was the treatment. So I grew up in the Midwest, going to Ohio State football games, wondering the next time Dad would vanish, and when he did, nobody was allowed to ask where he was or when he'd be back. And when he returned, no one was allowed to ask where he'd been. It was silence upon silence upon silence. Only when I went away to college, took off back for Cambridge, Mass. And Harvard, having turned 17, now 18, Dad pulled me in a study during my first spring break and said, "Son, perhaps you better learn a few facts about my life." He waited until I wasn't a child anymore, so he didn't go against medical advice. Here's Dad's photograph as the valedictorian of Pasadena JC, speaking at the Rose Bowl in front of many thousands. Here's the 6 brothers. Uncle Harold, whoops, we got to go back. I think I double-clicked. So over on the left is Uncle Harold, who was standing by the wagon in the earlier picture, who started drinking at 14, pretty rebellious thing to do for being the son of the Prohibition leader, and died of alcoholism. My Uncle Randall turned out to be an economist. He visited Dad every week driving up before freeways from Washington to Philadelphia when Dad was at Philadelphia State Hospital, convinced he was being held in a concentration camp in Europe. There's Uncle Bob in the plaid shirt, who did go to Princeton to earn his doctorate in psychology, who did get his MD from USC and became a psychiatrist, who had the worst migraines of all the boys in the family, who started prescribing prescription medicines for himself and then injecting, and then lost a leg and died of kidney failure, secondary to substance abuse. Brilliance and problems in the same family. There's Dad in the white t-shirt. There's his 2 half-brothers. They're both in their 20s. The other guys are in their 30s. They both are bald. Baldness is transmitted through the mother, male pattern baldness. Uncle Harvey was a famous pianist and musician. Uncle Paul is a soloist with the LA Master Chorale, so musical ability. And both of their firstborn sons, my compatriots, One has had schizophrenia for the last 45 years, and the other shot himself after a few years of schizoaffective illness right after he turned 30. So schizophrenia spectrum as opposed to more mood and substance abuse on the other side of the family. Genes tell us a lot. They don't predict everything, but even in Dad's, with the 6 boys here, the 4 brothers and the 2 half-brothers, there's some interesting genetic lessons. I went on, amazingly enough, to become a psychology major. Maybe I could solve my dad's problems. I began to think he didn't have schizophrenia. Why did he get so much better so quickly? What about this thing called manic depression? And I helped get him a proper diagnosis after I graduated from college. Here we are after I got my PhD from UCLA in Santa Barbara. Let's see, we got to go back one slide if we could. That's me with the mustache there. Dad's in his 60s, full head of dark hair. We had been talking regularly for the past 20 years about mental illness, about the fact he often thought he wished he'd had cancer, because that's a real illness. A mental illness, as he said, think of what that means to a philosopher. It's just in your mind. Maybe I made up all the symptoms. I was never sick. I was just weak. This is the student of Russell and Einstein, not knowing emotionally what mental illness is because no one ever told him. Now, if we go to the next, which I can do, this is just a few years later. I'd had my first temporary appointment at Berkeley. We're at Stinson Beach, and you can tell that Dad's lost about 25 pounds, starting to stoop, and ended up dying of a Parkinson-like illness, whether from the many years of the wrong medications. He was the 4th patient in America to receive Thorazine because his brother prescribed it for him, and received many electroconvulsive therapies that if he'd been diagnosed properly and treated properly, he probably would have never had. So it's hard to know what are the after effects of a major psychiatric illness, undertreated or perhaps mistreated. Diagnosis can matter if it prescribes the right treatments. So I have become not only interested in helping kids in trouble, not only interested in studying genes and brains and families and peer groups of people with mental illness, but also in stigma, because that's what prevented Dad from getting the help he needed. And we should know better in 2015, but we're not quite there yet. So just a little bit further, what do we know? It might take several different pathways leading to what we call the same mental illness, equifinality. Or conversely, the same early conditions, genes you're born with, experiences you've had, might lead to very different outcomes, multifinality, depending upon context and culture and experience. The DSM is helpful, but the world is not static diagnoses, yes or no. It's a much more complex world out there. Some of the work we do is with ADHD. You'd think ADHD, that's a pretty mild condition, no stigma there. But because of its unpredictability, because people think people with ADHD have their act together, it receives a lot of stigma. We have the largest sample of girls with this condition in the world at Berkeley. We've just finished our 16-year follow-up, so they're young women now. And we realized, because no one had ever done this research before, that when girls with ADHD who were impulsive when they were little grow up, they're at very high risk for suicide. 23% of our combined form girls with ADHD who were impulsive when they were kids had made a suicide attempt by the time they were 20. And 51% were moderately to seriously involved in cutting and other forms of self-mutilation. More than the inattentive exclusive group, more than the comparison group. You have to do longitudinal research to find that there might be some unexpected roots of seriously self-destructive behavior. We don't have time to tell why that happened. Go back one. I'm too quick on the draw again. One thing else we know about ADHD from the clinical trials we've done is, if you want to reduce the symptoms, medicine works pretty darn well. If you want to teach academics and social skills and help with friendships, it's that purple line going down the fastest and the farthest. It takes behavioral therapy at school and in home and teaching skills combined with medication if you really want to teach competence. Medicine's helpful, you have to have a multimodal approach. Finally, stigma. I wrote a book on this topic a few years ago, The Mark of Shame. This is the Hieronymus Bosch painting I chose for the cover, The Extraction of the Stone of Madness. That was the belief in Holland back in the 15th century that if you just took the rock out of the person's head, they would be cured. Probably not the most modern view we have. There's a lot of lessons we could learn. Stigma is still real. We know more about mental illness than 50 years ago, but the American populace is actually more believing that people with mental health issues are dangerous than in the 50s. We know more, but our attitudes are somewhat less tolerant. It's going to take a multi-pronged approach. Policy, changing human hearts, and changing the media to really get at stigma. Finally, I'm running out of time. Go back one, I was too quick again. Robert, please come up. Robert Villanueva, a big NAMI advocate and national trainer, part of our research team, and I and a group are evaluating Let's Erase the Stigma, which has just been funded by Bring Change to Mind. We saw the Bring Change to Mind social media poster on an earlier slide of Steve's. Here's another approach: start clubs at high schools, not therapy groups, but clubs where kids every week get together to talk about difference in bullying and stigma and mental health issues. We know from a study that Robert participated in that such clubs don't really goose up your knowledge of mental health too much, but they reduce social distance and they help you do things to fight stigma. We have amazing change in attitudes about gay marriage in the last 20 years in the United States. Never been anything like it, mainly from people under 30. We need to get with kids just when those attitudes are forming about mental health issues, whether they themselves have it or as their family members or their friends, and we think Let's Clubs, along with many other initiatives, are part of the way. I've gone over my time. These are the roots of my interest, and we've got a long way to go to fight stigma. Thanks a lot.